Hey guys, my name is Robert, and I want to thank you for watching these short series of videos. We want to cover just basic camera operation so that you will know what to control in your camera to create the type of image that you want to create. We're trying to avoid going into automatic mode because then the camera creates your image instead of you creating the image you want. And this really applies whether it's still images or if you're using video on your DSLR. The idea is exactly the same. So let's jump right in. If you want to control your images, there are three parts of your camera that allow you to control light, light is obviously the most important thing that we use to create our images. Without light, not much of an image. So those three items are your ISO, or your film speed. The second item is your shutter speed. And the third item, which is what we're going to talk about in this first video, is your aperture or your f-stop. Same thing, aperture, f-stop. So let's just jump right into this. So our aperture and our f-stop is a series of metal blades. It's usually housed within the lens. Some cameras are a little different, but it's a series of blades that when you close it down, they close down an opening. They begin to shut down within your lens. As you open it up, obviously, they open up and make a bigger opening inside your lens. So your aperture or your f-stop controls two things in your camera, in your image. It controls how much light comes into your camera, and it controls your depth of field. So how much light comes into your camera, that's fairly obvious. As the aperture closes down to a very small opening, you have much less light that comes into your camera. As your aperture opens up, there's obviously a larger amount of light that passes through your lens and comes into your camera. That's fairly obvious. The other thing that we mentioned was depth of field. So what is depth of field, you may ask? Well, depth of field is a little more creative. Depth of field is how much of your image, whether video or still image, is going to be in focus in front of and behind what it is that you're focusing on. For instance, if I'm taking a photograph of a person, let's say outside, if I close down my aperture so that it's a very narrow opening, then I have a greater depth of field, which means although I'm focusing on the person, the things that are behind that person and the things that are in front of that person become more in focus. So you have a greater depth of field, more things are in focus, and depending on your environment, it could be almost everything seems to be in focus. If I open up the aperture so that it's much of a wider opening, then I have a more narrow depth of field. So that means this person that I'm focusing on, if I have a wide open aperture, only that person remains in focus. The things behind that person or the things in front of that person will likely fall out of focus. So why would you want these two things? Well, pretty simple. If you're shooting a landscape photograph, typically, and there's always reasons to break these rules, but typically in a landscape photograph you may want most everything in focus. So to achieve that, so that everything is mainly in focus, you'll want a more narrow opening. You can kind of equate it to, as a person, if you're looking out and you're looking a long way away, a lot of times you may have to squint your eyes to see everything more clearly, and that happens more as you get older. But that's what's happening. You're narrowing down that opening in your eye so that everything becomes more clear. If you're taking a picture of a person in a portrait type environment, you may have things going on in the background, things like that, and you don't want to draw attention to those things. So you use a wider aperture, which means you have a much more narrow depth of field, where really only that person remains in focus. The things in front of and behind kind of fall out. Even in this video that we're shooting, we have a very wide aperture setting, so the things that are behind me are falling out of focus. Even the things that are up here begin to fall out of focus, and it's really just this area that remains in focus. So it brings attention to what you choose to bring attention to. So, reviewing, your aperture, which is a series of blades, can open and close at your discretion and all points in between. It controls two things: how much light goes into your camera, and it controls the depth of field. Okay. So, the only confusing thing about aperture is this. When you go to control those settings on your camera, and sometimes on some of the older lenses there may be controls on the lens itself. Most newer digital cameras have the controls within the body. When you go to control that aperture, you would think that the smaller the opening, the smaller the number, and the larger the opening, the larger the number. Well, it's backwards from that. This is the only confusing part, and it's easy to get past. If you have a small opening, it's actually the larger number. If you have a large opening, it's actually the smaller number. Let that sink in. So when you're choosing your aperture, some of the basic numbers that are on cameras are, let's say the aperture starts at 2.8, which is the smallest number. There are exceptions. And the largest number is f22. Again, there are exceptions. But we're going to use from f2.8 to f22 for your f-stops. And there are all the numbers in between as well. f2.8 would be the largest opening in your aperture, letting in the most light and the most shallow depth of field. f22 would be the more narrow opening, letting in the least amount of light, but giving you a much greater depth of field. You got that? That's mostly what aperture is. If you want to try this out and you're new to this, most cameras will have an aperture priority setting on them. And if you want to go outside and play with those settings, take a picture without moving of the same subject, whether it's a person or a brick wall on the side or something, and take the picture with a large opening, f2.8, or the lowest number you have. And don't move after you take that picture, then narrow it down, close that aperture down to f22 or whatever you have. Take the same photograph, focusing on the exact same item, and take the picture again. Go back, review the two pictures, and you will see that there is a tremendous difference in your depth of field. Hope this helps, and then please watch the next series of videos as we go over ISO and your shutter speed, and then how these things work together. Thanks for watching.